My name is Aristotle Papanikolaou. Most of you know people call me Telly. I am the co-founding director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center together with my friend and colleague George Dimokopoulos. There he is over there. We welcome you to this event, the second in what we hope to be very much an ongoing conversation seeking harmony and compassion. And I'm simply going to introduce the people who are really going to kind of lead the way in tonight's discussion. And we, first of all, want to express my thanks to both my colleague, Traina here at Fordham, and Ashely Purpura, who is a PhD in theology from Fordham University. We're very proud, Ashely. So let me do the introductions, and then I'll let them sort of take it away. So Christina Traina is the Avery Cardinal Dulles of the Society of Jesus Chair of Catholic Theology at Fordham University, a scholar of theological ethics with specialties in gender, sexuality, and childhood. She came to Fordham from Northwestern University, where she was professor of religious studies and former chair of the department. She's the author of Feminist Ethics and Natural Law, Erotic Attunement, Parenthood, and the Ethics of Sensuality Between Unequals, and the forthcoming Finitude, Feminism, and Flourishing on Being Mortal Like Everyone Else, as well as numerous articles. She's been active in the Society of Christian Ethics throughout her career, serving as board member, as president, member of the 21st Century Committee, and co-chair of the 2018-20 task force that conducted a nationwide survey of tenure-line and contingent faculty in religious studies and theology. She has served on committees of the Catholic Theological Society of America, where she currently leads the consultation on sexual abuse in the church, and is a member of several other societies for the study of ethics and religion. She has also served on the advisory board member of New Ways Ministry, where she occasionally writes for the blog Bondings 2.0. Ashely Purpura is an associate professor of religious studies in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, a faculty fellow of the Cornerstone Integrated Liberal Arts Program, and affiliate of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Purdue University. For the 2023 and 24 academic year, she's a visiting associate professor of women's studies and theology at Harvard Divinity School in the Women's Studies in Religion program, where she's working on a project titled Liberating Orthodoxy, Feminism, Faith, and Divine Otherness. She's the author of God, Hierarchy, and Power, Orthodox Theologies of Authority from Byzantium, and co-editor of Orthodox Tradition and Human Sexuality, and Rethinking Gender in Orthodox Christianity. Additionally, she has published several articles and book chapters on Orthodox tradition and contemporary theology, and is in the process of finishing a book that constructively engages Orthodoxy's historically patriarchal tradition through a feminist lens. Purpura is on the International Expert Committee of the New Directions in Orthodox Christian Thought project, sponsored by the Oslo Coalition on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and she is a MacDonald Senior Distinguished Fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. Thank you both, and I'll let you take it away.
It is just a wonderful honor to have you here, working with your writings and your materials that you've been producing has been such a joy in preparing for today. So thanks so much. For those of you who heard that I have a Catholic in the title of my position, I'm especially honored to be here and especially excited because, of course, the Catholic Church is dealing with all these questions as well, right? But our conversation, the fact that it's a little further along, it's not necessarily a good thing, because one of the very exciting elements of the characteristics of the conversation in Orthodoxy right now is that it is at such a creative and interesting stage when all kinds of possibilities for addressing the questions are open and people are thinking in really creative and innovative pathways of thought. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, though, if you could begin by talking about the state of the discussion in Orthodoxy. You've produced a study guide for conversation about this. Where is the Orthodox Church on sexuality at the moment?
Thank you, Christy, for that kind opening and bringing it into conversation with the Catholic context. So for Orthodox Christianity, we're currently in a space where both culturally and politically, the question of same-sex marriage, for instance, is a reality, a social reality for a lot of countries, the United States, for example. But the church has not engaged this question. So really, I mean, if we think about historically, we'll talk probably later tonight about some pre-modern examples of same-sex love or homosexuality or certain sex acts that the church reacted to. But what we don't have, which we now have in our cultural and social climates, is the opportunity to talk about same-sex love in lasting, committed, often marital relationships. And so the existence and the conversation that is emerging in a social and often secular context, and in other religious traditions, some of them Christian, is prompting Orthodox churches in different countries around the world to engage with this topic in a way they haven't had to before. So, for instance, some of the Nordic countries in Finland and in Sweden, the government is raising this question, right? How is your church going to respond to this issue that we see as a human rights issue, right? Gender equality, marriage equality, lack of discrimination based on things like sexual orientation. And so the Orthodox in these contexts have had to formulate a response. That being said, much like probably in the Catholic context, there's a lot of polarization, and this is very much tied up into political identity, cultural identity. And in some ways, for Orthodox around the world, they adopt a very reactive and socially conservative standpoint. And so in some ways, these issues just have not been talked about. They've been too taboo to talk about. It's unorthodox to even talk about things like, in my own work, feminism, that's the F word that we might talk about, or in liturgical and theological context, LGBTQ identities, marriage equality, these types of issues. So thankfully, over the past decade or so, maybe 15 years now, there have been kind of bubbling up both academic and ecclesial conversations around, okay, these people exist, they're in our communities, right? This is a social issue, both political and kind of government actors are asking us to address. And we haven't. So how might we engage with these topics, both pastorally, theologically, liturgically, and there hasn't been a unified response. So I think it was 2017, there was a letter from an assembly of German bishops where they wrote very pastorally about the need to respect LGBTQ plus individuals. I wish I could say we shouldn't need to say that out loud. But unfortunately, what we also see in the Orthodox world oftentimes is really hateful homophobia. We see priests or bishops enacting or encouraging violence at pride parades. We see this, for instance, in the Russian context, using things like homosexuality as a justification, one of many, for aggression and war in Ukraine. And not just globally, even in the United States, we see it's perhaps not uncommon, I wish it was, for priests to preach against homosexuality in their homilies, in their sermons, as both a social issue and a sinful issue, without acknowledging the people that are in their congregations, their family members, and how personal this is, not even acknowledging the ways that it is tied now, and certainly we might say always, to an expression of love, right? So this gets to broader issues of sexual ethics, and that we can come back to that. But so there's been these different conversations. Some of them I've been involved with. The Oslo Coalition that Telly mentioned put together this study guide and was kind of the basis, that and the Bridging Voices consortium that brought together scholars from different Orthodox contexts, both practitioners, scientists, clinicians, and members of the LGBTQ plus community to talk about their experience with Orthodoxy and how the Orthodox Church might do better. So the state of the conversation is there's people, Fordham is an example of that, trying to foster and open up a dialogue and spaces where we can ask questions and explore issues that previously have just been, there's no gay people in Orthodoxy. Well, we just know that's not true, right? There are whole movements, there are societies, there are online fellowships of Orthodox people who LGBTQ Orthodox Christians. And for us to deny their existence or their desire to be a part of the church or the theological ramifications of what it means to say you're Orthodox and intentionally exclude a particular group of people has yet to be really reflected on. So some of the study guide is one thing that's been produced over the past year that hopefully will help stimulate these types of conversations in parishes, but depending on the priest, that may not be practical, but in homes, in fellowship, and just to give people a space to think what maybe they've heard the church teaches can be rethought in perhaps more inclusive and creative ways, in a way that rings true with the heart of Orthodox theology.
I think it's so important that you're doing this work because, at least on the Catholic side, when I talk to my students at Fordham, I find that many of them have felt so hurt by their church communities that they have given up on Christianity in general. And so this is, of course, we want to think clearly and we want to look at our traditions carefully, but there's an urgency to the matter too, because we're turning people away who don't feel as though they have a home with us, right? I think one of the exciting things about this stage in the discussion is that the Orthodox tradition, like the Catholic tradition, has so many fascinating resources outside strict teaching on marriage and sexuality that we can bring to bear in these questions. And I want to say that our communions have done that in the past. For instance, both Orthodox and Roman Catholics have, now given the timeline for Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, recent is a relative term, right? But we have both recently realized that democracy might be a good thing and that a state church is maybe not necessary in order to pursue a rich Christian life. For instance, and we had to dive deep into our traditions. For Roman Catholics, that was partly into the natural law, natural reason tradition. We had to dive deep into our traditions to solve that problem, but we did, right? So what are some of the resources that have raised their heads for you in Orthodoxy that might not be the first thing that spring to mind for someone who's asking questions about the ethics of sexuality?
I mean, this is the place I feel like where Orthodoxy, because of its somewhat disorganized and decentralized nature, has a lot of potential. So when we say, these issues are, people are leaving the church, as you mentioned, the Catholic Church, right? Not only are they leaving, but it's also an issue of life and death, right? If we look at statistics for trans individuals, gay women, gay men, right? The statistics are just overwhelming, right? About self-harm, about harassment, abuse, and for the church just to ignore that is a problem. So it does have resources, right? So some of the things you mentioned, democracy, we could think of slavery as another issue, the role of women. None of racism, role of women, still not resolved within the church by any means, but have come quite far, as has the idea that you don't have to have a state church. Democracy can be a good thing. We could also think of the church in diaspora, so in a non-Orthodox majority context. And so for all of these types of issues, a lot of what happens within Orthodoxy is the change is necessitated by, here's the social reality, and then the church has to somehow bless that, or sanctify or deify that. So if we even look at the sacrament of marriage within Orthodox Christianity, one thing that I think the study guide does a nice job with is mentioning that marriage wasn't even a sacrament until the 9th, 10th century within Orthodox Christianity. So you have people getting married in what we might call now a civil ceremony, and then coming to the church and taking communion, and that's sufficient. And so one thing that we might think about is the history of the church adopting whatever the normal kind of cultural, social activities are for these types of unions, and then blessing that, right? So we have examples within Orthodox churches not widespread on a local basis, and I'm sure some bishops and hierarchs would disagree with this, of, for instance, blessing a same-sex couple in house blessing, singing a doxology for a same-sex couple after they have a civil marriage or civil union when they come to church, a doxology of thanksgiving, a way of recognizing this union as still being beautiful and what we might say theotic or divinizing, a way of communicating God's love to the world. So there's still kind of ways that already we see the church trying to respond, again, in a decentralized and local way. Within the tradition, if we think about the tradition both with a big T and a little t, we have a couple issues. The first is who determines what is tradition and how it should be interpreted? I've encountered quite a bit of gatekeeping around this issue in my own work on women in the church about how could we look back at historical sources and read it perhaps differently. We have lives of saints, for instance. Matrona of Purge is a great example, a female-born individual who then leaves a marriage, an abusive marriage, enters a men's monastery and lives as a man. Within Orthodoxy, Matrona is commemorated as a woman, right? So if we see icons, we will see her, we will see presented as a woman. But if we think about how Matrona talks in their hagiography about their own life, there is a way to read this as a trans holy narrative. Now, is that the dominant way that tradition has embraced this? Of course not. But is this a resource within our own tradition of seeing a type of trans sanctification, a path to holiness that does not depend on a cisgender normative kind of relationality? Certainly. So we have saints that do all sorts of gender bending and transgressing gender norms within their lives. So we have a lot of that. We have Saint Senya of St. Petersburg also, who wore her husband's jacket and lived kind of above, beyond, not real agendered, just did her own thing, right? So we have a queering within Orthodoxy, we might say. But again, we use those terms and it's very politicized. Within the Orthodox Church, this is not accepted. That's not what we do. You can't say that Orthodox is queer in this way that it's transgressing all sorts of boundaries. But if we look at, let's say, the apophatic tradition, the negative tradition within Orthodoxy that's so prominent, the emphasis on mystery and people being beyond ultimately being known cataphatically or assertively, there's a lot of room for difference, individuality, and affirming each person as uniquely an icon of Christ and being in the image and likeness of God. And if that's how God created them to be in this unique way, then we should venerate them. We should honor them. And instead of kind of assertively telling them how they should be or how they're right or how they're wrong. So I think there's the iconographic tradition is a great kind of resource. The hymns of the church, some of them are very erotic. So we have some hymns of Romanos the Melodist. We have hymns from different traditions that we still use. Some have fallen out of use, but are still part of our tradition, of this intense longing, erotic longing for God, that in some ways is disembodied, right? Orthodoxy is still struggling with the body, right? There's an ascetic impulse, probably coming out of our monastic tradition, that, sex in general is a problem. Well, thankfully, most people have come around, at least to the modern age, to say, okay, sex within marriage is acceptable, should be celebrated as a path to union with God, but even that is still a more modern kind of take. So there's hymns, there's saints' lives, and then there's the theology of the incarnation. God became human in the person of Jesus Christ, took on all of our humanity. We celebrate the circumcision as a feast day, right? So even if we say that, sexuality is not part of this, there's certainly theologians who look at the life of Christ and see Christ as queer. We see narratives and theology in different different Christian traditions that emphasize the fact that Christ most likely at the crucifixion was sexually assaulted, right, as a form of torture, being stripped naked. This is not something that's usually identified or talked about within Orthodoxy, but it could be, right? There's a lot of potential in the sources. We have great patristic writings, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor talk about gender distinctions and differentiation and how kind of the power dynamics between different genders that are seen as hierarchical can be undone. So I think there's a lot of potential, and so it's up to kind of us to look for ways to draw on that potential and to make our theology that we talk about consistent with what we experience. So if we talk to people about how they experience God in their lives or how they know they are loved or they are in love, they're not talking about, I'm judging other people. They're not talking about, I'm excluding other people. There's a wonderful new saint, Abbess Gavrilia, who was just canonized this past year, who went out and ministered to lepers. In some ways, she's like the Greek Mother Teresa. But she touched people. She was a podiatrist or a physiotherapist by training. And she would go out and touch the taboo parts of people, right? So there's this issue of like pushing beyond difference and just giving love, right? And this is something that I feel like we could learn from members of the LGBTQ community within Orthodoxy, that there is already a overcoming of social distinctions and things that kind of, I don't want to say straight people, but people are the church in some ways is hung up on that this is the division between Orthodox and unorthodox. This is the division between holy and unholy or taboo and sacred, but there's a way that love is transcending that. There's this beautiful icon within Orthodoxy of the harrowing of hell, where you see the actual doors of Hades or hell are broken and Christ is standing on top of them. It's usually the resurrection icon that's set out for Pascha, if it's not the empty tomb. And I think of this as Christ is like the ultimate boundary breaker. He smashed the bars of gates of Hades and overcame them and obliterated them. And what do we see in Christ's like own life if we think of scriptural interpretation? Christ is going out to the prostitutes. He's having dinner with the tax collectors. And in women's Orthodox theological interpretations, they really emphasize this kind of undoing of gender segregation, gender difference, patriarchal order, and the love of God being able to transcend human assumptions of difference. So I think that was a bit rambly, but there's, just to say that I think there are a lot of resources. So the study guide gives some resources, but there's also a lot of, one more thing I might add, is that there's, within Orthodoxy, different types of relationships that are already seen to be holy. So there's a historical brother-making rite that kind of gained popularity and scholarship and then was debunked and went back and forth. Wherever we land on what this rite accomplished, we do have evidence of blessing unions that, whether or not they're sexual, are between two people of the same sex. We have monastic friendships that we don't know what the monks and nuns are doing in their convents when the lights are off and the doors are closed. But what we do know is that they're living in close proximity, they're sharing a life together, and it's bearing the fruit of holiness. So there's lots of relationships that the church blesses, and there's an emphasis in Orthodox theology on the person and relationality as a form of communion. And I think that ability to see Christ and love Christ in your neighbor or in your lover or in your same-sex partner, that's hugely potential, right? So hopefully we'll continue to move in that direction.
Right. There are so many things to pick up there, but one of the ones that I want to point out, and I want to point out because Orthodoxy is a minority tradition in the U.S., and most of the Christians in the U.S. are Western Christians. They're Roman Catholic or some variety of Protestants. And for most Western Christians, especially since about the middle of the 20th century, the word eros implies Victoria's Secret. Okay. But I think one of the great gifts of Orthodox theology is that it has a very well-developed theology of desiring love, which is desiring the good, either God or what God has created. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, you mentioned it, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, why it's so valuable for this conversation.
Well, I think when we're talking about homosexuality in Orthodox tradition, a lot of times what people are really talking about is the sexual acts, right? There's, I mean, going back into antiquity, it's about who's the active and passive partners, there's power dynamics. And so there's, you know, when people look at, let's say, scriptural passages that they think are about banning homosexuality in the Bible, then there's, you know, more resourceful kind of recent interpretations that show this is not what Paul had in mind, for example. It's about certain, you know, oppressive, objectifying power dynamics. But even still, there's this kind of hang up on what are people actually doing with their bodies? Well, within Orthodoxy, we have this very robust erotic, it's not even just a mysticism. It's like an interpersonal communion, the desire to know yourself through communion with another person and to know that person and to know that person in perpetuity, right? As you would know God. So there's a longing that's not taboo, it's not a problem. I mean, certainly we'll find some monastic text that's like, you know, rein at it a little bit. But there's an idea that going out of oneself into another is both erotic and kenotic, right? So we think of Christ's love overflowing on the cross, giving up God's own privilege and power to be in communion and with the lowly human race. So that is, I mean, we can think about Christ's own self-giving as both a sacrifice and suffering, but also as an act of eros. So here we have kind of eros and agape, if we think of different types of love conflated and transfigured into each other. And so when we think about sex within Orthodoxy, we can think about the transfiguring of an objectifying, perhaps lusty, I don't know, again, Victorian terms, right? Type of relationship towards self-gratification instead towards how can I love this person in a way they understand and shows them God's love, and how can I also receive that love? So one thing that we, you know, when we talk about eros, we think, okay, we can either think of like celibate monks longing for God. Simeon, the new theologian in Orthodoxy, is kind of famous for his erotic hymns to God, both celebrating and critiquing kind of different actors in his life, but also emphasizing this. He has this kind of Christocentric view of Christ dwelling in him. He loves God so much that he's in union with God. And so we see this in the same conversation in Orthodoxy about marriage, right? That this is this unifying oneness. Well, should this only be for heterosexual couples, right? The idea that it's not about kind of what parts you bring to your partnership, but it's about having this desiring love to be in communion with someone else in a way that reflects and is transfiguring in God's love, right? I think, you know, I mean, there's a lot of potential there for this type of ecstatic going out and beyond yourself, not in a way that leads to like an abusive sexual dynamic. Let's just be clear, right? We're not sacrificing ourselves in the bedroom in a way that leads to abuse and objectification, but in a way that there's a mutual giving up of yourself and honoring the other person, right? In a way that hopefully is healthy and consensual and all these things. So I think the erotic is something that is transfigured in Orthodoxy, but it's not transfigured away from its eros, right? It's not transfigured away from its longing and going out of itself into some sort of pure agape. It can be the same thing. And we can think of Christ, as I said, or the Trinity, as like overflowing love out of itself and desiring so much communion with humanity. So there's, you know, I think there's a lot of potential there that we don't have to be ashamed, right? Especially in light of the resurrection, don't have to be ashamed of people's bodies or sexuality.
Right. We didn't talk about this before, but I'm struck by people are often fearful and anxious about change. There's a worry about slippery slopes. There's the sense that also sometimes that people have made great sacrifices to live according to the set of rules that they had been told were holy, and can be almost resentful if any change occurs, right? So what is what are some of the fears that are operating in the conversation that can be difficult and are hard to break down?
So there's definitely, I mean, this is fear, right? Perfect love drives out fear, but yet we see fear, and within Orthodoxy, a certain triumphalism. So Orthodoxy means right belief, and Orthodox have a whole Sunday of Orthodoxy devoted towards, like, this is the faith of our fathers, this is the faith of the Orthodox, which, okay, that's so nice. But also, it's a problem, because if we're trying to have humility, right, know that, okay, what we know about God, what we know about our tradition, what we claim as the right belief, is just a small little sliver of who God actually is. Like, our knowledge of God's love is just like this little tiny, we can't possibly, back to the erotic, we can't possibly, like, absorb and know all of God in a way that wouldn't just completely obliterate us. So Orthodox could take on this humility a little bit. So there's a fear of, I'm just holding on to, like, sexual purity or sexual morality, or I'm just really trying to be straight, but, I just really am gay. So, there's this kind of, like, really holding on to these things that that we think might make us Orthodox. But God is so much bigger than that, right? So there's a way of seeing that if you let go of these things, you're not less Orthodox, because the right belief is really in the God who loves. So if Orthodoxy, you think about it, it's not so much, I'm fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, I'm abstaining from sex during Lent, I'm, talk about sexual rules and rigidity, I'm doing all these things. That's so nice for you that you're doing these things, but that's not the content of your faith. If that brings you closer to God's love and in relationship with your neighbor, because how do we know that we're loving God? We can't say we're loving God and then being cruel to the people we encounter in our lives. So this is the kind of, if you're doing all these things, but you're not letting that love transform you in your relationships, then I don't know what Orthodoxy is. So, I mean, we can put up all the rules, all the ascetic sayings, all the calendars, all the debates. This is all very important, but what is most central, at least in my view, again, just a laywoman just up here, saying my bit, not a hierarch, for instance, is our relationship of God, our experience of God's love, our communicating that love to other people, and receiving that love. And that also takes humility and receptivity and knowing ourselves to be loved by God. I mean, that's what it is to be Orthodox, not to be overly relativist or just boil it down, 2,000 plus years of Christian history and all these ecumenical councils and wise, pious teachings. But all of that only works in the service of bringing us closer to God's love. If it's bringing us closer to judgment, then stop. Again, refer to your parish priest. I'm just not...
Over everything you put on love, I think that's in Scripture somewhere.
Right.
Yes.
So.
Well, I'm really glad that you mentioned the lay woman part, because here we have this in common,
yes.
Right? In some ways, we are ecclesiastically insignificant because we are not ordained and we are female.
Yes.
However, there's something about the question of who and what is the church and exactly how change occurs. Those of you who've been paying attention and reading like into the third page of the newspaper or the 10th layer of internet news will know that Roman Catholics have been trying to sit down together and have egalitarian discussions with each other, thinking about what the church is, what the church should be, and how we should move forward. Now, that doesn't mean that the Pope doesn't come out and issue edicts. We're having trouble living into this new reality. But the most important insight in that practice is remembering that the church, well, we have more of an organization than you do, right? But that the church is not in some office in the Vatican, right? But that the church is all of us together. So how do churches change? What is the role of lay people in preserving the tradition in a new key in changing times?
So I mean, this is beautiful, and I would still say take heart, because the Catholics at least are coming together trying to have an egalitarian conversation. The Orthodox tried to have a hierarchical conversation just a few years ago, and that was still kind of unsuccessful. So we're still working on that. But you know, how does change happen? So in some ways, this is to like take heart, right? The hierarchy, the group of bishops, we see some of them being involved in these conversations I mentioned at the beginning, right? Some have interest in addressing these issues. Some, however, do not. And to get them all to agree and say, as Orthodox Christians, we are now all, let's say, going to allow or bless same-sex unions or marriage, I don't know that they've used that term, in this particular way. I doubt that we're going to get there soon. But for those of you that are like, well, then what hope do we have? The church is not just the hierarchy. We saw this, I think, somewhat beautifully during the pandemic when people were celebrating Holy Week in their homes and making little cardboard tombs and decorating them with flowers and baking holy bread and just putting it in front of the TV. So not that these things are substitutions for living in a sacramental, liturgical, communal life, but they're ways that people already have made Orthodox, let's say, same-sex wedding services. Are they officially recognized by the church? No. But are, for those people getting married to each other, wearing crowns, processing around an analogion, reading scripture services, is God still with them? I would hope so, right? They're trying to reclaim their faith. So in some ways, yes, it's coloring outside the lines. I think within Roman Catholicism, right, we might think of like women's ordination. Mm-hmm. So we have churches, you know, with women priests, but they're not officially within the communion. Sure, we have this, but these things still have impact and they matter to the people that do them, right? So then within Orthodox Christianity, we have change that can happen at the local level. We see this, for instance, with the position of women. Has the church officially changed its position on like women's roles in the church? Little by little, in some jurisdictions, we're seeing like 2 steps forward and others 3 steps back. But what we do see in secular society is women are neurosurgeons, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're professors. And so when they come to church, they're less receptive to just taking a subordinate, silent position. They're on parish councils, they're leading things, they're reading things, they're being more involved. And so I think in some ways, as much as, I mean, this is kind of a personal issue for people. What is a safe space for them? Can LGBTQ Orthodox Christians continue to be engaged in the life of their parish in a way that is safe and not abusive to them and kind of soul-crushing to them, but somehow affirming? Can they help be that change by continuing in that environment in a way where they're reclaiming the tradition and the faith for themselves? Perhaps they have a supportive and sympathetic priest. These are all ways that kind of at the local level, discussion groups, people can start, the study guide, they can start talking about these questions. And I think for a lot of Orthodox Christians, these issues are deeply personal. If it's not them, it's their brother, their sister, their children, their aunt, their uncle, their priest. And so this is no longer something outside the church. And I think as people, as the church, are more welcoming, inclusive, and encouraging, and refuse, in a certain way, refuse to participate in and let their hierarchs, in some ways, not that they're accountable to the people, but there is a certain measure of pressure that can be applied. Refuse to let hatred or homophobia or be preached in the church or to be practiced in the church. There's subtle ways of resistance that I think will have an impact over time. And again, that might not be fast enough for some people, and for some people, it might be the safest, most Christian thing to do is to not participate. And that needs to be acknowledged. But for others, there's a way to still participate in the life of the church that will hopefully bring about some change. Right?
Yes, and I think you're right. Often changes in practices lead to changes in people's just general instinctive understanding of what the church is. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking on our side of the fence, Pope Francis said, well, you know, anybody who wants a blessing just wants to grow closer to God, so don't ever deny people a blessing, right? Well, if people just get used to those blessings being available for all, then pretty soon they will wonder, what was it that was wrong with gay marriage again? Right? And so the change in the ethos that comes about because of the way that both clergy and lay people practice their faith can lead often to changes that are theological.
Right.
But it takes a while.
And that kind of cognitive dissonance that they might encounter of, well, at my workplace, I don't talk about people this way. My neighbors, my family, I interact in this way. I show them respect. I show them love. I attend their weddings. And then I come to church and suddenly we're not doing that. And this is supposed to be the right belief. That seems like, there's going to be an inconsistency that's going to be recognized. And I think that's part of what's bubbling up and making these issues have to be addressed within the church, as that people are looking at pastoral practices, and even in theory, they might say, oh, this is sinful, or oh, we don't allow this within Orthodoxy, when the person is standing in front of them, coming up to communion, or is in confession with them, or is standing next to them, singing in the choir. Now, their response is personal, right? It's interacting with that individual, unique person. And so hopefully, that person-based change will then hopefully bubble up to some policies and, more organized kind of shifting.
One of the other things that I think is a stumbling block for people, I know it is, at least on our side of the fence, is the idea that God created male and female genders and sexes, right? And that gender is tied to sex. There are just two sexes. And that to transgress that in any way, either by same-sex pairings or through non-binary or trans life, would be in some way to insult God's creative energy. Is that something that is problematic for Orthodox people, and how are you addressing that in your work?
Yeah, this is definitely something that we see within Orthodoxy, and part of it, I think, at least in the United States, is also being steeped in a culture that's heavily influenced by Protestant and Catholic, but very publicly Protestant kind of gender complementarity, right? That there's particular roles for women and for men, and we see this in some Orthodox writings, and then these different charismas kind of are only brought together in heterosexual marital unions. But if we look in the tradition, right, there's a way of looking back in the tradition saying, well, we have all different types of performing womanhood in our lives of our saints and our historical tradition. We have all different types of men doing kind of womanly things historically, of mourning and being humble and losing control of their emotions in a way that's sanctified. Even Jesus wept, which would be a feminine kind of characteristic. So we see that type of rigid kind of, here are the roles for men, here are the roles for women, or there's only male and female. What about intersex individuals? So our edited volume on sexuality has this beautiful chapter about intersex, not God's mistake, right? So God in creation is providing other opportunities of seeing not just male and female, masculine and feminine, man and woman, right? But that there's a whole diversity, a whole spectrum of different ways that people might be a human being in the image and likeness of God. But people have invested a lot of energy in defending this binary. In Orthodox hymns, for instance, there's a singing across genders. Now, yes, it's historically in a patriarchal tradition, so it's really men singing or women singing in a manly voice, which is praised because there's an privileging of men, and a little bit less of men singing as women. But there still is this kind of back and forth of, it's spiritually beneficial to sing from a different positionality, to imagine yourself as Mary at the foot of the cross, to imagine and sing from in the voice of a man, of Joseph, discovering Mary pregnant, to sing as the sinful woman, anointing Christ's feet. So there's this kind of, if we think of adopting these different viewpoints that are not natural, whatever that means, to our kind of beings, we think that's already spiritually beneficial, and we sing in this way. might we also think it's beneficial to interact with people that live in this way, right? So, I mean, there's both issues of kind of humility, too, of not telling other people who they are, but encountering them and letting them reveal themselves to you as an icon of Christ. And this, I think, Orthodox maybe struggle with, as do other Christians, of, yes, but I know what's right. So I need to, as an act of love, I need to tell you what's right. I mean, I don't recall a passage in the Bible or have encountered an instance of Christ saying, let me tell you what's right in your life for you and who you are. So I think, if there's a way to show love, it's to already kind of be loving to people without judging them, allowing them to disclose themselves to you. And that takes humility. It takes kind of an unknowing of your assertive claims of other people. And it takes a type of kind of veneration of the image of God within them that may not fit in this strict gender binary or gender essentialism, which I think in some ways is very much disrupted by the lives of the saints in our tradition already.
So it takes hospitality,
Yes.
It takes invitation, and it takes willingness to be surprised.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
By someone revealing the image of God in a way that you were not expecting.
And then to overwhelmingly be rejoicing and love that image within them. Not
Right,
like, oh,
exactly.
let me change you.
Right,
I
right.
received you, I had my invitation, I was hospitable, and now there's just part of you that I can't accept.
Right.
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 Wow.
We've been dancing around it, but I think that one of the other wonderful theological resources that weaves its way through all of the work that you've been engaged in with your colleagues is Theosis. So, and it seems to me that this is a really helpful theological term for two reasons. One of which is it reminds us that we are all to become more Christ-like from where we are within our embodied, created selves, but not just within our individual embodied, creative selves, but in relationship with others around us and in our place in the world. And do you want to add to that or?
Well, I just
elaborate?
say that theosis is really beautiful. Theosis just participating in God and becoming God by grace. So it's a big concept in Orthodox contemporary theology. In antiquity also, Telly is kind of the, I don't want to say the spokesman for theosis. I think I've embarrassed him. But divine human communion, I feel like you should come up on the stage here. He's written the book, so to speak, on theosis. But there really is something that's tied to the incarnation, right? That God becomes human so that we might become God. And this doesn't mean just parts of us, right? Or just the heterosexual folks, or just, everything but our genitals becomes divine. Simeon, the New Theologian, again, he has this great hymn, 15, where he's like pointing to different parts of his body. He's like, here is God also. And he's not joking, because if we actually believe what we say we believe, then even this part of us is divinized. So things like all parts of our human existence can be deified, right? And this doesn't mean that they're just like taken as they are and then just we pour on some divinity and we're good to go. It means it's transfigured in that image and regaining that likeness of God. So things that are warped, oppressive, and damaging can be undone, right? And turned into something beautiful. And so that involves working with God on our part, right? A type of synergy, a cooperation with God. And so Orthodox, unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, often look at homosexuality as an area of like, this requires your repentance to be deified. But really, if we see love, no matter what form it's taking, bearing fruit and already transfiguring that couple or those individuals, then I don't understand how we could say that this is not theotic, that this is not the image of God, the presence of God in this union. And so part of our job as kind of Christians is just to recognize the places that God already is. And so theosis isn't something where you kind of can just finish it. So if we go back to the erotic, it's an ongoing, eternal, we're always, because God is infinite, we're always becoming more and more God-like, participating more and more in God, and through love. It's not through just like fasting and I feel like I'm taking an anti-ascetic turn in this talk that maybe I didn't mean to, but right, there's self-control. It is Lent. Self-control is a good thing, but also in the service of focusing our attention on God, but not God in an abstract way. God is an interpersonal way. So this is where the theosis happens as a community as well. It's not just an individual enterprise. If I'm just going to really try my best to become like God today, okay, how did that go? Right? Did you cut that person off in the parking lot? Did you open the door for that elderly person? No. So it is in communion and also helping those around us also where they need it to achieve theosis. And achieve, again, is like a never ending. It just keeps going in greater and greater divine likeness and divine love. So I think it's a helpful concept because it also involves the body. It involves emotions, and it's culturally and particularly situated to each individual person. God became human in time in a particular context, and now all the material world is sanctified. So this comes from our theology of icons as well. So everything is sanctified. And so that means that even these very human things that we struggle with, God is still in those tiny things. God cares about those little things. And so all those pieces of us are redeemed. It's not just like in theosis, our mind, our intellect, or our nous is deified. It's our whole person is transfigured in Christ.
Mm-hmm. I'm still stuck thinking about my behavior on the Merritt Parkway.
Throw my microphone down.
Have you had a chance to have these discussions in parishes? And if you have, what have been some means that have been really helpful in overcoming people's fear of change?
So I haven't had the opportunity to have it as like a parish-wide discussion. Mm-hmm. I've had one-on-one discussions with individuals about these issues. And a lot of times the fear is the fear of, like I said, doing it wrong, somehow becoming unorthodox. And some of this is very politically charged, right? Culturally, there's some messaging from hierarchs, like if you believe in same-sex marriage, you're not Orthodox. That's the litmus test. Yes. Same thing with abortion, or for instance. So there's these kind of gatekeeping mechanisms and discourses. But interpersonally, when I talk with people about these issues, sometimes they just need to see it personally, right? They can't imagine if this person that is a lesbian, if they can imagine that person as Christ, which they already are, then somehow that helps. The idea of church being an exclusion, right? Instead of being kind of a banquet where everybody's invited, is also helpful because they don't want to believe in Christ, and their experience of Christ is not one that excludes and is angry. Now, this is not universal, right? But for some people, they want to be able to include people, and they just need kind of the theology to help them say, yes, it's okay. Oh, I can put this weight down, and I can bring this person to church with me. I can go to their wedding, and I can stop judging them, right? So giving them the tools to think about, our tradition in a different way, or how they encounter people in a different way, sometimes is very helpful. But there is still kind of a fear of becoming unorthodox. Mm-hmm. So I'll be interested to hear for those of us that maybe use the study guide in parishes or in kind of group settings, what questions arise. Yeah.
So speaking of hearing from others, I have monopolized you. And so we would like to give people some opportunities, thank you, some opportunities to ask Ashely questions. There are a couple of mics out here, so please ask away. I'll try to direct traffic a little bit.
So they could
But-
also ask you questions as well.
So,
Or we could all just ask Telly about theosis.
right. So, questions? Yeah, right here.
Thank you very much for your conversation. Some of the more hateful things that you hear in the Orthodox Church are pretty disturbing, but I wanted to ask you about kind of the more gray areas. I know some people in the tradition who have no personal problem with, their relationship with gay people, but, aren't comfortable with the direction they think LGBTQ is going these days. And, I think that you could make a very reasonable argument that, the civil rights movement in the United States was largely driven by the religious community, whereas I think a lot of people feel that, or some people feel that the current LGBTQ movement is being driven largely by the secular community without really having a grounding in the religious tradition. So have you found that kind of problem? And if so, how do you address it?
So I'll just say that, yes, there's certainly a fear within a lot of Orthodox communities that this is some sort of secular, progressive, liberal imposition, right? The world is changing the church. Well, the church changes, and it does so along with society, but it doesn't have to be a negative thing. There are parts, so when we presented Orthodox or human sexuality and Orthodox tradition, this edited volume at a conference once, and one of the respondents said, this book is, pushing such a kind of new perspective that we could talk about homosexuality and Orthodox Christianity, but it is still far from some sort of pro-sex, liberal, all-encompassing agenda. It's still so far from that. So in some ways, we're kind of where the Orthodox are emerging in this conversation is about kind of that same-sex relationships, including sexually active relationships, can lead towards theosis, right? There can be spiritual fruit born out of same-sex unions. We have seen that. We just see it in our communities and the lives of people we know. But what we also can say is that, okay, but then there are certain things within an Orthodox ethics of sex that we're not going to consider at this time. Polyamory, right? So there's certain things, open relationships where we're still kind of situated, the conversation is still based on what is already received as normative and deifying in terms of a heterosexual monogamous marriage. And so there's conversations that we're not even having yet, that the queer community is yeah, been there, done that. We've already accepted this. This is part of who we are. And I think you see that in both the study guide and the edited volume are in some ways still very much focused on male homosexual acts. And there isn't much discussion of women's homosexuality, right? And part of this is based on the historical tradition, right? That's where their concern was, and these young man, older man kind of sexual activities. And so there's still a lot more to be said. We invite conversation partners. There's also issues of asexuality, people who are not married, not monastics, not looking for either of those. Or single people. We have all sorts of things that are just not part of the conversation. Some of it for ethics, some of it because we have blind spots in our tradition and we haven't developed that sensibility yet. So I think there's room for that, but I think in terms of the fear of change, where the conversation is right now is just going just a little tiny step. So I don't know that it would make the whole, if we think, and there isn't just a unified LGBTQ movement, right? There are multiple pride parades in any given town to represent different demographics. But there's some ways that the movement within Orthodoxy is still very conservative. It's still talking about lifelong monogamous relationships, Still talking about sex within those relationships, not with multiple partners. Certain oppressive or certain types of kinks and fetishes are not something that Orthodox are ready to talk about in terms of sexual ethics. So there's, yeah, I don't know if that quite got at your question, but there, in some ways it's still very conservative. Yeah.
And if I could jump in to emphasize something that you said, the culture throws LGBTQ together plus, right? IA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have not that much in common across that spectrum. It's a coalition in order to create a space to have some conversations.
Right.
And so when, as last Friday, somebody like Pope Francis says, oh, gender ideology, this is the worst thing in the world, help, right? He's addressing a reality that doesn't, he's addressing a chimera.
Straw
There
man.
is no such thing as gender ideology, really, right? Now let's talk about what insights gay people, lesbian people, bi people, trans people give us into our human nature that people also who are straight and cis might learn something from about themselves.
Yeah,
right?
and about their faith. Yeah.
And about their faith,
Right,
exactly.
right, yeah.
Hello, I'm Christina. Thank you very much for this conversation. I feel like I've been waiting for it for a long time. I'm Orthodox Christian, and I'm also a lesbian woman. And I've definitely always had to like check that out when like entering the church, and it's like the cognitive dissonance is definitely there. So thank you, first of all. And I guess I have two questions. One is just like, how do you both continue what you're doing and like still identify like with your religion, and like how do you find that patience, because it's like it's very difficult, especially when these are the people, right, who are supposed to love you, and how do you do that personally? That's the first question.
Yeah, we can take your second question after. Yeah, for me, it's, I mean, I'm in a place of relative privilege and safety in like my career, for instance, where I have the freedom to talk about these issues without any type of kind of real pushback. Certainly, you know, I get some emails from people who think that, you know, I should go become, Orthodox always say this, Episcopalian, and I'm like, I'm like, that's, I guess, an honor to say that to me, but for me, the Orthodox faith is like my religious vernacular. It's where I encountered Christ and came to love God and know God. And for me, there's a lot of beauty in the tradition and in the theology that I'm just not going to let somebody else take from me. And, you know, that's my own stubbornness, but also I feel like there's a type of reclamation and rehabilitation that somebody needs to be involved with. And if I can just, it's going to take a while, right? And not everyone has the patience or the position or the privilege to engage in that work. But for right now, I have that opportunity to kind of speak in certain times and in publications and things to try and address some of those issues that I'm able to. But it is a community effort. So it's, you know, there are consequences and people have to weigh and measure those. But for me personally, it's an issue of I still love the church, and I'm very sad that harm it's doing to other people. And I feel like Christ is kind of suffering along with those people, because when we're doing it to them, it's not like they're not Christ, right? So when someone makes you feel unwelcome in the parish, we've just uninvited Christ to our liturgy. It's just, it's very sad. And so I'm hoping and longing for the beauty that I find within my faith and I know is there, that it can be actualized and realized in its praxis.
I think I would second everything you say, but just for me, coming out was a spiritual experience that confirmed my faith and my belief in God's love and grace in my life, my embodied life. And so it actually cemented me even more firmly to my religious communion and made me feel that I needed to stick around to be part of the community of change. But I find it very important to make community with people like myself in my religious tradition, because we need each other, right? We need each other for those moments when we think, oh, am I going to hear that sermon again, right? You need to be able to send an email to someone or have coffee.
And you had a second question.
Yeah, I guess that is going into my second question of like when and how and where can you start those conversations, like in parishes or like, you know, maybe a conglomerate of parishes. Like I would be there. Let me know when.
I mean, in some ways it depends on kind of the parish and like, do you have a priest that you think would be welcoming and hospitable to these types of conversations? If not, well, I don't want to say just like, do your own thing, but there are other forms of community that don't have to have clerical oversight, right? Are there other people in your parish or in your city, that different Orthodox parishes, or people that have left the church, right? Like, there's a lot of online communities now, so is there a place to find connection and to start that type of conversation? But certainly you don't want to put yourself... Yeah, I mean, Fordham, but you don't want to put yourself in a space of vulnerability if you're not ready for that. Like if you're not out to your priest, for instance, or this type of thing, and you want to make sure you still have a place to take communion, that's a very personal decision, and maybe you need to start these, not you individually, but maybe we need to have those conversations in a different environment where there's a little bit more security and you know that you'll be affirmed.
You can be surprised too.
Yeah.
In my parish in the Chicago area, when it was time to start a ministry, a couple of people went to the priest and he said, "Where have you been for the last 10 years? I've been waiting for somebody to want to do this," right? That can happen. Mm-hmm. That can happen.
So I wasn't going to say anything, but after your two questions, what's your name? Christina? Nice to meet you. My name's Angelo. Maybe this will help. Firstly, the two of you are incredible. The two of you are incredible. My wife and I, we've traveled 60 miles to get here. We took a car, a train, and then we walked 30 blocks in the rain, and it was all worth it. I've known my wife for 47 years, been married for 42. She's been Greek Orthodox all her life, born in Greece, never put any pressure on me to be chrismated, and I was in Nick's church, now my church, St. George on 54th Street, and took a journey with Father Sophronios. When you ask the question, how do you keep doing this? How do you keep going when the conservative side of the Greek Orthodox Church is opposed to female deacons, the civil rights vote in Greece, giving the LGBTQ community the right to marry, and accepting the LGBTQ members in our Greek Orthodox Church? It's because of the 6 letters that make up the word Christ in Christian. It's Christ who taught us the way that we need to go. And not just with his words in the Sermon on the Mount or in his parables, but also his actions. You know, before the Last Supper, in a room below, Christ called his apostles together and he washed their feet. And that was the ultimate show of humility. He showed that everyone is on equal footing. No one is above the other. I mean, he upended social norms. No king and servants, just everyone together. And today, 1 out of 10 people in the world say they belong to the LGBTQ community. Whether you go back 100 years, I'm not an academic, so I haven't done the research, but if I were, I would. But if you go back 100 years or 500 years or 1,000 years or 2,000 years, that number's the same. It doesn't change. Jesus Christ knew this. He knew that amongst his apostles, there were 1, 2, or 3 members of the LGBTQ community. Did he ask them to step aside? Or did he wash their feet also? Did he show that they're all equal? And someone might say, well, how did he know? He knew. I mean, he knew that Peter was going to deny him 3 times, right? And Peter did deny him 3 times. And then after the resurrection, what does Christ do? Christ goes to the Sea of Galilee. He looks out at the boat with the apostles, and he calls them. And at first, they don't know who he is. And then they realize, Peter, who's denied him 3 times, who has sinned, he doesn't hover behind the other apostles. He jumps out and goes to Christ because he knows that Christ is love and forgiveness. And it's very disappointing to my wife and me when we hear, and rightfully so, that this is a slow process, because in our lifetime, we're probably not going to see the change that we want to see. But, so that's part of my answer. And the question is, knowing all of this, why is it so difficult for the conservative side of the Greek Orthodox Church to understand what Jesus Christ wanted, what he taught us, what he showed us, and that is what we need to follow and nothing else?
So I don't know that I mean, because of where my own thinking is, it's a little hard for me to understand, honestly, to understand why people so tightly hold on to these very conservative viewpoints. And I think much of it has to do with having constructed an identity or turned to orthodoxy specifically because they were turning away from the secular world or from what they saw as immoral influences or changes. They wanted something constant, and then now orthodoxy's changing. And so there's this little bit of, it's not a little bit, there's this kind of concern of if orthodoxy changes, even though it does, right? If it includes these people or includes this type of ritual, then does it become unorthodox? And so how do we move people who have these kind of conservative viewpoints? I received an email the other day from someone who was very concerned about Jesus' teachings of sexual purity. And I looked, I could not find Jesus' teachings of sexual purity. But this person holds advanced degrees, was very convinced, right, that Jesus taught the teachings of sexual purity. So, I mean, these are people that also love their faith, that are trying their best to be Christians, and in some ways, I don't know how much we can convince them other than our own witness, right, and that over time will bear fruit. And so we also have to be Christ to them, right, getting in arguments at coffee hour. I mean, certainly, it's hard not to defend your own children or your family members, and I'm not saying anyone shouldn't do that. But sometimes we have to look at, like, do they have such a different fundamental starting point on what they think is right or what they think is essential to orthodoxy that we're just kind of talking across each other? So then, are words going to be helpful in convincing them? Perhaps, perhaps not. Or should it just be, come over to my house and meet this relative, or, we can just pray for them. So unfortunately, I wish I could say there would be a quicker change, or there's a easy, let's just, show them this amazing theology of theosis and apophasis and the mystery of the other and the image of Christ in everyone. And these are all resources that we can draw on. But I don't know that it's our responsibility, just as it isn't their responsibility to change the homosexual individual to a straight individual. I don't know that it's our responsibility, other than sharing if they ask, for us to try and convince them to become more accepting, right? We can pray for them and see Christ in them and show them Christ in us, right? So I think that's the best we can do. Maybe others have more concrete solutions or effective means, but just talking about it in a way that isn't overly taboo, I think, really helps, and sharing how we think I don't know that everyone here is like-minded, but how someone might be Orthodox and also accepting of LGBTQ individuals in the church, as participants in the church and participants in their own lives, in a way that we affirm them as individuals, their relationships, without as much judgment as usually is carried in church discourse.
So first of all, a wonderful discussion, enlightening thoughts. So I come from the Roman Catholic tradition. I guess this question is a little bit more abstract than the previous ones, which are more concrete on personal issues. How might the reality of LGBT people enable, like, Roman Catholic ethicists to be able to sort of move beyond like a natural law approach towards more like a personalistic approach? Because I know you mentioned that the Eastern Orthodox tradition seems to have the concept of personhood play like a larger role, but I feel like you can also find resources within the Catholic tradition, such as Catholic personalism, that are able to account for LGBT realities. And do you think that that might play a role in sort of getting to a better understanding of those realities?
Maybe I'll defer to you here.
Absolutely. A friend and I are compiling a list of theological anthropologies right now that do that. But for instance, Dan Horan has written a book in which he draws on the theology of John Duns Scotus, which is much more an individualized theology of personal calling, which doesn't ignore but kind of bypasses the question of gender. Doesn't say, before all else you are a man, or before all else you are a woman. Before else you are a person called by God in whatever way God reveals God's desires for you. So yes, getting away from natural law can help, although you could look into Craig Ford, because he has reconfigured natural law thought to take into account LGBTQ issues to some degree. So I would recommend you look at some of his work, because if we're thinking about natural law as participation in God's creative reason, aren't we limiting God quite a lot if we decide what kinds of creations God can and cannot make?
Yeah.
Right? So he may be helpful.
Yeah, you can't put God in a box.
Right.
I mean, just to boil it down.
Thank you, Dr. Traina, and thank you, Professor Purpura. I just, before I ask my question, I just have to say, Professor Purpura and I actually were in undergraduate at the same
OCF.
time. She was in charge of OCF, and truly, I think kind of my own maturation in seeing Orthodoxy, not strictly as a, like a social engagement, but as like a authentic spiritual expression started with Ashely at Florida State. So I mean, I think I credit a lot to her, and I'm just so proud, really, like, to see her up here with her, penetrating insights and expertise. But to get to my question, I apologize because it's somewhat speculative, but what do you envision, a shift in the way that LGBT members of the Orthodox community, and really, I guess I would say for Professor Traina too, for the Roman Catholic community, how do you envision that this change would take place? And specifically, is there a historical analog of something you might be able to point to in thinking of how that might play out? Because at least in the Orthodox domain, it's the decision makers are individual bishops and synods of bishops. So unless those individuals, I guess, change their mind, or is there other mechanisms to affect, like a change in the way this plays out in the tradition?
Well, I mean, historically, we have the state imposing on the church, but that's not necessarily a positive help. But I mean, we do see that a little bit in the, I think it's in the in one of the Nordic countries, where basically the state, it wasn't about homosexuality, but it was the way they were organized. They're like, we're not dealing with your Russian bishop, your Serbian bishop, your Romanian bishop, and your Greek bishop. You guys just have to get together in terms of Orthodox unity and give us one bishop to talk to, and that's who the state will deal with. So in some ways, external pressure, the secular, is not always a bad thing. In terms of kind of change, if we just think of the marriage rite itself coming so late into the Orthodox tradition as being a sacrament, and then a very robust marriage theology kind of develops, but really not until quite recently. We might think of something similar for same-sex marriages, right? These people are already married. Let's say the couple converts to Orthodoxy after already being married, maybe having children for decades. They become Orthodox. Is the church going to tell them to divorce? Hopefully not, right? Is there some sort of blessing, right? I think the larger leap would be, a lot of theologians that are talking about this issue now are like, well, it's not marriage, but we could call it something else. There is some blessing we could offer, right? So I think starting there, I don't think that it should be the end, have a hierarchy of relationships in the church. That also seems pretty problematic. But it could be, I would envision that being the first kind of change, is that we already have people who are married in a civil union now coming to the church. Or we already have people that have transitioned now coming to the church. And so these types of questions, in some ways, externally, the pastoral response, which might even start with local priests asking permission of the bishop, not like, let's think about this in a think tank and then deliver a message of, here's our Orthodox teaching on this. So in that way, it might be kind of case by case, which is problematic in terms of inconsistency, but we see this in the American Orthodox context. It also gives people options. If one parish will not accept you, maybe the church 20 minutes away will accept you. So in some ways, the Orthodox disorganization canonically in the United States can also be a refuge. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it's idealized or anything like that, but it can sometimes provide pastoral opportunities for individuals if a certain parish is very inhospitable.
I also have to remind myself that future bishops have to come from somewhere. And if they grow up in churches like Ashely is describing, right, they probably will have a different understanding of their Orthodox identity. Mm-hmm. It takes patience, especially because on my side of the fence, it seems that most people who are interested in priests right now are kind of restorationists in a way. But lay people are just going about their business, right? So
we'll take two more questions, right? And we have one here, and Rachel will go.
Hi. Thank you so much for your voices. Sorry, is that? It's so refreshing, and I think that we can all agree that at this point in our tradition, they're not the loudest or the most predominant voices. So one thing that is maybe concerning, I'm in an Orthodox church, in an Orthodox tradition. In the last couple of decades, as society has in some ways become more inclusive, more broad-minded, there's been a trend of people converting to Orthodoxy coming from very conservative, and sometimes even Roman Catholic tradition, because they feel that Orthodoxy is kind of a safe space for their homophobia and their misogyny. Right. Yeah. That other churches are kind of losing their way, and that. So, how do we combat this, or what is how do we engage? How do we not engage in the culture wars and allow the culture wars in this country to kind of define the terms of discourse for our growth?
I mean, this is a huge challenge, and it's in some ways, at least in the United States context, one of the reasons, for instance, like certain bishops are opposed to like restoring the female diaconate because it'll cause fragmenting and loss of membership in parishes and with other Orthodox bishops. So one thing I can say is that it's helpful very concretely, if the parish is large enough or diverse enough to include people from lots of different backgrounds. So if you have a whole parish, let's say, converts from some sort of Protestant denomination because they're looking for the true faith, the conservative faith, that's going to be very difficult to have this type of conversation, right, or make some kind of progress, unless we can show them that it's actually more orthodox, right? So this is where theology is very helpful. So yes, some converts are reacting to the world, towards things that they see as problems within more liberal Protestant or even Roman Catholic traditions, and so they're kind of fleeing. We've seen almost an exodus of fleeing to Orthodoxy because of its conservative position. But okay, we can give them some time to season into parish. But then is there a way to show theologically that Christ is more inclusive, that Orthodoxy honors individual differences, and is not kind of stuck in this rigid way, this rigid fundamentalist kind of mentality? I mean, that's a real pastoral challenge, but it also can take the work of kind of laity and those that are kind of longer members of the Orthodox Church and have kind of seen its variety maybe on a global scale or in different parishes. So it's helpful if you're in a large city like New York where there's lots of different types of Orthodox, right? It's more challenging if you're in a more rural or suburban area where there's one Orthodox church for like 150 miles. And so if that church is just kind of very conservative, you're left with the choice of, do you kind of go and see what can be done, or do you just not go to church or do Zoom church, or what are your options? But I think because there's an earnestness in a lot of those converts to be really super Orthodox, if there's a way of kind of rebranding that super Orthodox doesn't mean only having sex on Tuesday nights because you're keeping all the canonical rules of abstinence and fasting, it means that you are loving unconditionally and radically in this kind of outpouring, life-giving, liberating, paschal joy kind of way, then I think there's potential to transform even people that may have initially come into Orthodoxy for that conservative way, to show them, look at our great tradition that has shifted, and yet we preserve this kind of record of the Holy Spirit at work in the church in time. And oh, look at the Holy Spirit at work in the church right now. And so this is where we're moving kind of in a different direction, perhaps. But I mean, it's heritage, the defining of tradition, and it's, the defense and triumphalism of Orthodoxy as being against the world instead of deifying the world is really a challenge. So I don't have an easy answer, but I take hope in the theological kind of background of the church.
Okay, Rachel, one more. I just got here. Please,
Hi. I just first wanted to say that I see 3, but there might be more folks from my parish here. And I think it's really important that for me as a queer woman to see members of my own parish here is so beautiful and heartening, and it increases my feeling of community with all of you. And so I just wanted to share in that blessing, since I have the mic and I can do that. The question I have, speaking of this sort of maybe potential bifurcation, is I had a question about how much of this really ties to patriarchy. So for example, we have this whole, in the study guide, there's this whole part where it's lesbian sex was okay as long as one partner didn't get on top, right? Clearly as long as one wasn't the man, right? And that so that's the first kind of little section, but really what I want to know from a parish perspective is how queer women can navigate the double positionality within our church of being both women and queer, and the ways in which sometimes expressing queerness can be to the detriment of us being able to make inroads as women, and what that sort of coalitional reality in our identity looks like, and how to be whole rather than bifurcated. And that wholeness is why I wanted to thank my fellow parishioners for being here, because thank you for letting me be whole, and I love you all very much.
I have one more question. I just got here, and I've been a founder of the Optios organization, Orthodox Christians, back in 1983. I'm still kicking. I'm thinking I've been victim of a hate crime by fellow Greek Orthodox. And I'm struggling for the rest of my life, for the past 3 years, being crippled. But I have some information from Optios, if people want to help continue the struggle of the Orthodox Church with dealing with gay and lesbian issues and everything else under the alphabet. But
Thank you.
I don't know if this is on the internet. I mean, is this on, will this be on YouTube or something?
Yeah, we are recording it.
Can we make some comments?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I have so much
Sure.
history. During the AIDS crisis, the most horrendous for the Orthodox Church to show their Christianity. We buried so many, 95% of our membership have died because of that. I've been jump-starting the organization since the 90s. You get more people who would march with us in gay pride, who are not Orthodox, who are Buddhists even, than to find Greek or Eastern Orthodox to march with us. It's been a struggle. You know, our church is just not listening. I mean, I go to the parish out here in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, Holy Cross. I was attacked in a hate crime. The priest reprimanded Leo for attacking me. But he wouldn't come to the police station to file a report for a hate crime. Because Bay Ridge they don't know how to deal with it. And we don't have, when you're being victimized as a senior citizen, I'm 72 years old, you just can't continue when there's no support in our church. I mean, not even our stupid council people and representatives would come with me to the police department to demand a report because they're all Bay Ridge is still mafia. You know, you see the movie Serpico, that's required viewing of everybody. It's because police corruption still continues, and our church sits back and still receives donations from this guy who attacked me, because he's a pizza store owner. So, how sensitive is our parish and our closet gay people?
I would,
To stand up for us. They don't. I'm 22 years old. Every day I want to commit suicide. There's no direction. There's no people who are willing to stand out. Not even a police officer. Let me come and help you, George. Not one. And not one of my parishioners would stand up. They would like to avoid have their children forced.
I think this is, I mean, I'm very sorry for everything that you've shared.
I mean, I'm still struggling.
But-
I'm still marching with my cane and everything for the past 3 years. And I have Buddhists marching.
I think this is a, I mean, you give us an example of how the church needs to be on behalf of its members, needs to be on behalf of its members, not over its members. But the church isn't just, the hierarchy, but all of its parishioners. So this is something like lay people can do, is to be an ally, to be on behalf of their other brothers and sisters and others in Christ. And Rachel, to your question about what do we do with this, queer women's dual identity kind of in the parish, right? And I think we see this maybe not just for queer women, but if we could have women's organizations, let's say, or women, I hate this term, roles for women in the church, like here's your role and then don't step out of it. But if we could imagine women in the church is not just doing these traditionally feminine things, cooking, cleaning, teaching Sunday school, these are all wonderful things, but also so many more in diverse ways so that maybe it wouldn't feel like, oh, I'm this way outside of church, and when I come to church, I have to perform femininity, right? Especially since there's this huge tradition, I mean, partly because of patriarchy and this androprimacy of women performing manliness, and that's how we know they're holy. So especially for perhaps queer women who don't fit into a traditional kind of femme role, there should be space, celebrated space within Orthodoxy, especially with Orthodox tradition, Orthodox saints, Orthodox hymns, in a way that in some way is kind of problematic, but could be reclaimed in a more positive way. So I think that there's allyship, right? Being on behalf of each other, both in your case, but also in terms of how do we make ourselves more available to support each other in our diversity, right? And include each other and be on behalf of each other's liberation and life, right? We proclaim Pascha, Christ is risen. I know I'm jumping the gun. We haven't even started Lent yet in the Orthodox Church. But this is like the feast of feasts, the, you know, the holiest day of the year. We celebrate it every Sunday. And yet, what, do we just leave that joy behind, leave that, you know, boundary breaking, leave that resurrectional message just when we hit ascension? No, is there a way to kind of reclaim that possible joy on behalf of each other and try and bestow that to each other? And it might mean doing difficult things, standing up to authorities or hierarchies. So I will just say that I think the patriarchal kind of specters of orthodoxy, I mean, they're everywhere. We don't hide it. We still call our leaders patriarchs, right? So in terms of, right? Just like straight up, this is what it is. So in terms of dual meanings, right, and things that we kind of push against and could have allyship and kind of strategic coalitions against, I mean, patriarchy also is both an oppression of women, but also an upholding of a power structure that privileges a particular type of men. So it's a disadvantage both for men and all their diversity too, right? So if there's a way to kind of push back against the patriarchy in the way that the world depicts it, and instead see it in a more canonic lens of how Christ reveals humanity, not just masculinity, but reveals being a human person. I think there's potential there.
We definitely will keep. We could stay here all night, I think, and really start talking about, continue to talk about this. But we'll keep this conversation going here for our center. And I want to say just a couple things. One is for the students here, make sure you just take the trays of cookies and fruit and take them back to your dorm if you want. Also, what is your name, sir? So if anybody wants to know about Axios, which actually was leading the charge in many ways that over the past few decades, yeah, well, I mean, but now you have more allies. So, I mean, I think, but please come see George for more information. And last but not least, thank you very much to our two